Good afternoon, teachers. Today's lesson, we're going to take a look at the very first lesson that I do out of AP Macro Unit 4B, which is to introduce the concept of the money market. Note, these are the end of the unit if you're following the order that the book tends to do things in, but I like to do money market, market loanable funds, and then monetary policy so that I can force students to model the monetary policy changes on the two markets, whereas the book tends to do it the opposite direction. Either way is fine. But this is the way I do it. So this is generally my first major lesson of Unit 4B, which are the models and monetary policy. So here we're going to introduce the new model students haven't seen before, and that model is the money market. So we're going to attempt to answer first, what is the money market? Essentially, the money market is tracking the money supply, SM, and in this case, we're talking about M1 and or M2 money. They're both good here. So it's tracking the money supply and its relationship to the demand for money, or the amount of physical currency being demanded in our economy. The y-axis of the money market is what we really care about here. That's the thing that's going to make a big difference. And on the y-axis, we're going to be tracking nominal interest rates. You may notice either on the AP exam or in some textbooks, they will just label this axis interest rate. That is also acceptable, but I like to be a little more specific with the students that the money market is the nominal interest rate because it helps them to differentiate the money market from the market for loanable funds, which is going to track the real interest rate. And so because in the past my students have had some difficulty kind of conflating the money market with the market for loanable funds, I make a big deal of pointing out that the money market is tracking nominal rates, whereas the market for loanable funds is going to track real rates, and that'll be the next video that we do here. On the x-axis of this particular model, we're going to track the overall quantity of money supplied and demanded in the economy. We don't really, at least for the purposes of this Unit 4B, we don't really care all that much about the quantity of money. It's not going to impact that much going on. It's really the nominal interest rate that we're going to focus on here. So we'll want to know what happens to it, but quantity of money not as important for answering FRQs as the nominal interest rate is going to be. So taking a look here, it looks like a pretty standard graph with one exception, that being that the supply of money is a vertical line. And so we'll need to spend a minute to talk about why it is that the supply of money is a vertical line and what that says about the relationship between real interest rates and the quantity of money supplied. So let's do it in reverse order. For starters, since the supply of money is a vertical line, it basically tells us that there is no relationship between the nominal interest rate in the economy and the quantity of money that's being supplied in the economy. And this makes total sense because the amount of money in circulation doesn't increase or decrease based on the interest rate. Rather, it increases or decreases based on the Fed's monetary policy. So your main driver of the money supply is going to be the Fed, and the Fed doesn't necessarily change the money supply in relation to changes in nominal interest rates. And so the money supply is going to change whenever the Fed says it changes, not when nominal interest rates change, essentially is what this is going to tell us. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail in just a second. The big thing they need to know about the demand for money here is that money demand is a downward sloping, like all demand curves are, but they need to know why money demand is downward sloping. So essentially this tells us that demand for money is essentially the amount of cash that people will want to hold to have on hand as opposed to in banks or savings accounts or bonds or anywhere else. And what that downward sloping demand for money tells us is that people will demand less cash when nominal interest rates are higher. And the reason for that is because if the nominal interest rate is high, I can earn a lot more money by keeping more interest by keeping my money in an interest-bearing account like a savings account than I can holding it in cash. And so we'll see consumers hold less cash when interest rates are high because the opportunity cost of holding cash goes up when they could be earning high interest. Whereas when interest rates are relatively low, there's really no point in holding your money in the bank because you're not earning that much anyway. And so we'll see consumers hold money in cash when interest rates are relatively low. And that helps to explain why the demand for money has that weird downward slope that we care about. We'll get into that more in just a second on the next slide. So, jumping off our discussion of demand for money, there's essentially two different ways to frame the determinants of money demand. So I'm going to do it first the way the book chooses to do it, and then I'm going to do it again the way that I like to do it a little bit better and the way that I was taught to do it, and also the way the AP exam has asked about it in the past. So the first way to go about this is just to do it like we did every other demand curve for pretty much every other model, which is to make a list of determinants and kind of go over which of these determinants is going to cause rightward shifts versus which of these determinants is going to cause leftward shifts. The most common determinant that's tested on the AP exam for demand for money is inflation, aka changes in the aggregate price level. And this one I think is pretty good because it's relatively straightforward. When the price of goods and services goes up, it just requires physically more dollars to make a transaction than it is when prices were low. So when there's high inflation and prices go up, we'll see an increase in the quantity of money demanded. And when prices go down, which they don't generally, but if they did, we would see a decrease in the quantity of money demanded. So higher prices, rightward shift in DM, lower prices, leftward shift in DM. Other ones that occasionally come up, one will be changes in consumer spending habits, and this will sometimes be framed as changes in GDP. It could be framed as changes in consumer confidence and kind of bring in future expectations there. However they choose to phrase the question, basically when consumers want to go out and buy more things, they require more money with which to make those transactions. And so we'll see rightward shifts in the demand for money when consumers want to buy more stuff for whatever reason, and leftward shifts in the demand for money when consumers want to buy less stuff for whatever reason, like consumer confidence is low or our GDP is falling or something like that. Third, we have changes in financial technology. The way that I've seen this tested before is in a couple of ways, one of which is a question centered around the invention of ATM machines, which made it easier to get a hold of cash. The other way that they can phrase these questions is centered around the idea that, well, we're moving away from cash entirely. And so that would be like a debit cards question. Generally speaking, advances in financial technology, at least in recent years, have led to less necessity of holding on to cash. Personally, I don't even hold cash most of the time. I just walk around with my cards or my phone, and I can pay for everything I buy on a daily basis without ever actually touching money itself. And so generally speaking, more advanced financial technologies, be them ATM machines or debit cards or e-payments or any of those things, Apple Pay, those things generally reduce the overall amount of money demanded in the economy. So I only have one arrow here showing what happens with the demand of money is shifting to the left, because generally speaking, that's what happens with advanced technologies. We just don't have a need for holding physical currency as much as we used to. Like, it's not the 80s. Last but not least, we have our fourth big one, and this is going to be changes in financial regulations. And there's a whole host of different things that could pop up here. Everything from, withdrawal requirements to capitalization requirements for banks. I'd be really surprised to see this one come up on the AP exam, but just in case it does, any financial regulation that makes it easier for consumers to get a hold of cash will reduce the demand for money. Because the easier it is to get money, the less money I'm inclined to hold on to. Because if I need it, I can easily access it and go hold on to it. Any financial regulation that would make it harder for consumers to get a hold of money would increase the demand for money. Because if it's going to take a lot of effort for me to be able to get cash out, I may take out more than I need and hold on to it just so that I don't have to go through the hassle of getting it later. Let's move on to the other way that you can frame the determinants of money demand, which I think this is the next way is the way that I actually teach it in class, because I think it's a little bit more clear, and it is something the AP exam has tested. Quick apology here. It looks like I ordered these slides in a different order than I thought I did in my head. So we'll get to the alternative way of introducing determinants of demand for money on the next slide. But this slide, it looks like we're going to cover what the model actually looks like when we see shifts in the demand for money. Apologies there. I did this yesterday and I didn't remember what order I did them in. So essentially, looking at A over here, we have increases in the demand for money. And what we'll see here is that increases in money demand drive up nominal interest rates. And the reason that we care about that is, there's a whole bunch of reasons we care about it, but what the students need to know about that is that when nominal interest rates go up, a whole host of things kind of have a chain reaction in the economy. The most important of which is that students need to know that nominal interest rates and investment spending, and in addition to investment spending, interest-sensitive consumer spending as well, have an inverse relationship. Basically, when interest rates are high, businesses borrow less to invest, and so they invest less. And consumers who are going to borrow money for houses and cars might hold off on those purchases because of the high interest rates. And so higher nominal interest leads to lower levels of investment spending and interest-sensitive consumer spending, which in turn leads to lower levels of aggregate demand. So we'll see leftward shifts in aggregate demand when the scenario illustrated here in A actually occurs. And those leftward shifts in aggregate demand result in lower levels of real GDP. So essentially, increases in the demand for money will drive up nominal interest rates, which will eventually have the effect of harming the economy because higher interest rates dissuade consumers from buying expensive products and dissuade businesses from investing. Another thing the AP exam likes to put in questions about changes in money demand or money supply is a question about what's going to happen to bond prices. At this point, hopefully students know that bond prices are inversely related to interest rates, nominal interest rates in this case. So higher nominal interest rates will actually result in lower bond prices. The reason being that when bonds are issued, they're going to pay a set interest rate. So let's say that I've got a bond in 10 years. It'll pay me 3% per year. If nominal interest rates rise in this scenario to 5 or 6%, then nobody's going to want my 3% bond when they can just buy a brand new bond that pays 5 or 6%. So the value of my existing bond at a lower interest rate will fall, is the reason why this occurs. In scenario B, we have the opposite occurring here. So we have decreases in money demand leading to lower levels of nominal interest rates. And so what we'll see happen as a result here is that investment spending and interest-sensitive consumer purchases will increase because, you know, rates are cheap and why not borrow money when it's cheap. This will drive up aggregate demand, real GDP, and that same 3% bond that I had in a previous scenario, it looks a lot more attractive if interest rates have dropped down to like 1 or 2%. So that'll drive up bond prices if my bond yield is higher than what you can get on a brand new bond, as is the case in this scenario. All right, moving on. This time we're actually going to go to the other way that I frame changes in demand for money. Sorry, I was doing that a little bit out of order here. Okay, so the way that the older textbooks tended to do this, and I've seen this, it tested this way or asked this way on the AP exam, is they'll tend to frame the demand for money, we're going to call it DM here, in terms of essentially a super simple equation. So the equation here is going to be DM is equal to DT plus DA. And in this scenario, DT is going to be transactions demand for money. And this is the amount of money that's going to be required just to go about your daily business and make purchases. So this is essentially money being used as a medium of exchange. And so we understand that overall demand for money, part of the overall demand for money is how much money is being demanded for people to go about their daily lives and use that money as a medium of exchange, money to go out there and make purchases and pay for things. The other source of money demand is DA, or what we call asset demand for money. And this is demand for money not to make purchases, but demand for money to hold on to as a store of future value. So the other, rather than just going out and making purchases, I may want to hold on to some money to save for retirement, or I want to hold on to some money to save for a future purchase. So if I'm looking to get a hold of hard cash, not to make purchases, but rather just to hold on to it and squirrel it away for future use, this becomes asset demand for money. I'm just going to simplify it saying that, you know, it's money demanded to save as opposed to spend. But this way I like to frame it as well when I teach it in class, because I think it's a little easier for students to understand a whole host of factors that'll impact how much money people require for transactions, such as increases in the aggregate price level, versus how much money consumers are looking to hold on to as an asset. Something like low consumer confidence in the future would lead to more hoarding of cash, which might lead to higher asset demand. So this is another way to frame it. I would do both if I were you. So tell them the determinants and tell them that DM is equal to DT plus DA, because I don't think introducing this requires all that much additional time, maybe 10 extra minutes in class. And just in case it shows up this way on the AP exam, I want my kids to be familiar with this as well. So at this point, we're going to move away from money demand and take a look at money supply, which I think is both in some circumstances a little bit more straightforward because there's really only one determinant, that determinant being the Fed's monetary policy, but also a little more complicated because understanding how monetary policy impacts the money supply does require quite a bit of explanation. Because I tend to do this lesson before I've done the entire module on monetary policy, I'll give students kind of a general introduction to the three tools of monetary policy while not going super deep into like open market operations. So I trust that at this point, they're just going to write this down in their notes as determinants of the money supply, and that by the time we're done with the unit, when we've gone into really in depth into what each of those monetary policies is going to do, that it'll make a little more sense to them. So essentially, the Fed's monetary policy are the determinants of the money supply, and therefore, the three things the Fed engages in when they do monetary policy will be the three determinants of the money supply. Those are going to be including changes to the reserve requirement, which is the amount of demand deposits banks are required to hold in required reserves. If the reserve requirement goes up, banks are required to hold on to more money, thus reducing their lending capacity. And if banks lend out less, the money supply falls, because remember, through multiple deposit expansion, those banks' loans would normally be expanding the money supply. In this scenario, they can loan out less, so the supply of money will shift to the left. Should the reserve requirement go down, that would allow banks to lend out more, which would result, through multiple deposit expansion, in a rightward shift in the money supply. The second major piece of monetary policy here is going to be a change in the discount rate and or the federal funds rate. This one may require a little explanation. So the discount rate is the rate that the Fed charges banks when banks borrow money from the Fed, whereas the federal funds rate is the rate that banks charge each other to borrow money. And both of these have essentially the same impact on the economy. The difference being that the Federal Reserve has a direct control over the discount rate. The Fed determines how much they're going to charge banks to lend them money, whereas the Fed only has a targeted or kind of an indirect influence over the federal funds rate, but the Fed doesn't directly dictate what the federal funds rate is. But they can target it, and through a host of policies we'll get into in another video, they can actually change the federal funds rate indirectly, but not directly. That's not super important for right now. What they really need to know is that when interest rates for bank borrowing go up, banks borrow less money, and so they lend out less and the money supply falls. When interest rates for bank borrowing go down, banks borrow more money, so they can lend out more money, so the money supply will increase or shift to the right. Last, and definitely not least, in fact, it's the most heavily tested of these three, is the Fed's engaging in open market operations, determined by the Fed's Open Market Committee that makes monetary policy. There are two open market operations, and I just realized I misspelled market here. It looks like a D. It's supposed to be a T there. Sorry. The two open market operations here, the Fed can either buy bonds on the secondary market or they can sell bonds on the secondary market. And we're talking about U.S. Treasury bonds here. You'll need to explain to students that we're talking about the secondary market for bonds and not the primary market. So this is not the Fed buying and selling bonds directly to the Treasury or from the Treasury. This is the Fed buying and selling bonds that banks purchased from the Treasury some number of years ago. So this is secondhand bonds as opposed to primary bonds. Should the Fed decide to buy bonds on the open market, they'll enter the open market with cash, offer the banks cash now, and they'll get bonds in return for that cash. And so now the banks have fewer bonds on their balance sheet, but more cash in their excess reserves. This will lead to additional lending from the banks and increase the money supply through the money multiplier. Should the Fed decide to sell bonds, they're going to be giving the banks bonds and taking the banks' excess reserves in exchange for those bonds, resulting in banks being able to loan out less money and thus, through the money multiplier, reductions in the overall money supply. So there's essentially three determinants of the supply of money. Those determinants are going to be changes to reserve requirements, changes to the discount rate or federal funds rate, and open market operations, even though I spelled it wrong here. Let's move on to our next concept, which is what happens when the money supply changes. Okay, on this slide, we're going to take a look at what are the effects on the economy when the money supply changes. The first thing that I want to introduce here is easy money versus tight money policy. So on the previous slide, we made a list of monetary policies that will cause the money supply to increase and a list of monetary policies that will cause the money supply to decrease. And so students need to know that any monetary policy that increases the money supply is known as easy money policy. And those policies include reductions in reserve requirements, reductions in the discount rate, and the Fed buying bonds on the open market. And these policies, as we'll find out in just a second, are inherently expansionary to the economy. So that's the easy way to get them to remember it, is that easy money is expansionary because they both start with ease. On the other side, and maybe not so easy to understand, is that any policy that results in reductions in the money supply are known as tight money monetary policies. Those three policies include increases to the reserve requirement, increases to the discount rate, and the Fed selling bonds on the open market, and that these tight money policies, as we'll learn in just a second, are going to be inherently contractionary to the economy. So make sure that they know easy money versus tight money. Easy money is expansionary and tight money is contractionary. So looking at our graph in scenario A, we have increases in the money supply caused by the Fed adopting some easy money policy. And the result here that we really care about is that expansions of the money supply are going to result in reductions in nominal interest rates, as is evidenced from our move from equilibrium point 1 to equilibrium point 2. When those nominal interest rates fall, just like happened when we shifted demand, we're going to have increases in investment spending and interest-sensitive consumer spending, which are going to result in increases in aggregate demand, higher levels of our GDP, and existing bond prices will go up as new bonds will be paying a lower interest rate than existing bonds that were taken out previously. On the tight money side of the equation over here, we're going to see leftward shifts or reductions in the money supply, resulting in higher nominal interest rates, resulting in lower levels of investment spending and interest-sensitive consumer spending, resulting in lower levels of aggregate demand, less GDP produced, and eventually lower bond prices, as existing bonds will have a lower yield than new bonds, and so nobody will want them, so the value of those bonds is going to fall. So essentially, what we really need to be able to do with the kids at this point is to connect the Fed's monetary policy to changes in interest rates and connect interest rates to changes in GDP, because that's going to impact the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model that they'll need to connect the dots to a little bit later on. And so that's why I do it this way. I'll be like, change in interest rates, change in investment spending, change in aggregate demand, change in GDP, to make sure that they have all of the steps. And you'll need to do this 5 or 6 times before students will remember it, but do repeat yourself here to make sure that they understand that all of these graphs that we've been learning about all semester, they're all pretty much connected to each other and they all impact each other. So it's not like the money market or the market for loanable funds or the aggregate supply and demand model exist in a vacuum. They all exist in relation to each other, and that's generally what the FRQs in this course are going to ask them to do, is to draw relations and make sure that they understand how all of the different parts of the economy interact with each other and what impact those interactions are going to have on the overall macro economy. Because the money market and the money supply tend to be relatively esoteric concepts, whereas something like gross domestic product and productivity is a little bit more concrete, I'll usually end the money market lesson kind of with just a big ol' who cares. Like sometimes I'll just write who cares on the board and make the students tell me, because I need to hear from them that they understand how the money market impacts their daily lives, in this case via our GDP and overall productivity changes. And so this, I know I've said this several times in this video, but I'll reinforce it here again because kids need to hear things 5 or 6 times before they'll remember it, and that's okay. We just want to make sure that we reinforce the idea that interest rates impact investment spending and interest-sensitive consumer spending. So they basically impact the IG and the C components of GDP, and those things happen to be the determinants of aggregate demand. So interest rates have an inverse relationship to aggregate demand, which in turn gives them an inverse relationship to GDP. So there's less productivity when interest rates are high because there's less investment and less consumer spending. And they also need to know that because interest rates change aggregate demand and GDP, that they're also going to affect the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. I'm hoping, having done the Phillips curve already, students understand that inflation and unemployment have an inverse relationship to each other. Hopefully they also know that our GDP and inflation have a direct relationship, and our GDP and unemployment have an inverse relationship to each other. They may know that deep down inside, but I've noticed students sometimes have difficulty explaining why that is. So you may want to give them kind of a throwback bit of practice here to make sure that they can still connect the dots between aggregate demand, GDP, inflation, and unemployment. And then once you've ensured that they connect those dots, then ask them to connect interest rates to those dots as well and make it a little bit more complicated, because that's something the AP exam likes to test quite a bit. Anyway, hopefully this video is helpful to you. I'll try and get it uploaded today, and let me know if you've got any questions. You know where to find me.